What's up, dads? It's your boy Big Dave here with another episode of Culture Dads, Age of Sword and Cassette, where two based publishing dads do deep dives into retro pop culture for folkish and dissident minds. Today, we're going to talk about something that is pretty cool. We're going to talk about a topic. We're going to do a deep dive into nationalist classical music. Now, classical music, for me, is something that's a little bit of a different beast. I didn't grow up listening to classical music. I kind of discovered it, as I started to get into music, right? I started, my first introductions into music were like rock and roll and then heavy metal and so on and so forth. And then along the way, as I was learning guitar, learning how to play music and learning kind of the intricacies and how music worked, I stumbled upon classical music because I actually had a really cool music teacher in 7th grade that really encouraged me. And he was a huge fan of classical music. And the first classical music that I listened to that he suggested was Wagner, because he knew I was into even at that time, I was very big into mythology and all of this kind of stuff. And
that's a good fucking start, man.
It was a great
good
start.
One.
It was a great start. And he gave me a CD, right? It was a burned CD back then. And he gave me this burned CD of Wagner, and I listened to it, and it blew my mind. It was really, really cool. And you know what? While it is a different experience than listening to like a heavy metal song or a rock and roll song, or it's not that I don't get into it the way I get into doom and thrash and all of these different genres that I like. When you listen to rock and roll and heavy metal, you're with the song, you're paying attention and everything like that. For me, when I listen to classical music, and I still listen to classical music, I have certain composers that I put on first if I'm writing in a certain genre. For example, if I'm writing sword and sorcery, and I'm doing something specifically for my character Lucius Lex, I put on Vivaldi, because it has that kind of 16th century kind of dark thing. It launches me to I'm not thinking about the music when I'm listening to the music like I am with rock and heavy metal. It launches my brain into like a somewhere else. It is. I always say that all art is fantasy, and all fantasy, the key to fantasy is immersion. And classical music, especially really good legendary classical music, is very, very immersive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Classical music. It was a different sort of experience for me. I mean, both you and I, Dave, like the heavy shit. Like we really like that's our passion. But for me, I actually did grow up listening to classical music. In fact, I've always loved it as long as I can remember. I still remember my dad playing this album called Parkening Plays Bach, which is it was a cassette that he had of this classical guitarist Christopher Parkening playing all this Bach music. It was an immensely moving experience. So I loved Bach from the very beginning, and Mozart and everything like that, like the classical and Baroque era stuff. But of course, you also see classical music in movies, and this is where it ties into what you were saying, Dave. It's an incredibly immersive experience. It kind of puts you into a place, puts your head into a space, a mood, or just like transports you somewhere. And that's why it's used so much in movies. It's very cinematic. You think of something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, famously, or the Rite of the Valkyries seen in Apocalypse Now, or even something like Fantasia, where the whole point is the music and the movie is built around the music. This kind of classical music works very, very well in movies. But most classical music in movies is not Bach or Mozart or Vivaldi. It's actually mostly Romantic era music. It's Bach puts you in a very specific kind of headspace in terms of what you're imagining. Same with Mozart and Vivaldi and all that. But the Romantic era stuff, it's so moody and dramatic, and it's perfect what they call program music, like music written around a kind of a scene, basically. So I knew I loved classical music in movies as well, like the Romantic era compositions that you would see on the screen from a very young age. And then you grow up and eventually you discover, what a piece like Rite of the Valkyries is really all about.
Mm-hmm.
You discover the kind of deep ethnic and nationalist motivations behind it. And, at the same time, or maybe soon after, you're taught that nationalism is something that's ugly, something that's barbaric and evil and degenerate and all of that, right? But the music's power still remains. Like that scene, it doesn't denigrate the scene in Apocalypse Now one iota. So you have this kind of weird dilemma if you like this stuff. You have to choose between the beauty of the music or the evil that it represents, if you really take it on board and understand where it's coming from, especially Wagner, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example here. I sent Dave a playlist. I'll probably post it in the show notes so that everyone can listen to it. And one of the pieces from that, or a couple of pieces from that playlist, is from this thing called the Peer Gynt Suite by Edvard Grieg, who's a Norwegian composer. And I'll describe the experience with him, but I had the same experience with Tchaikovsky, with Mussorgsky, with Wagner, and a whole bunch of others. Everybody knows the music from this classical suite. There's so many famous pieces from it. Mm-hmm. And then the music has this kind of autumnal quality. It sounds like autumn, or like even the piece Morning Mood that everybody knows. It's the sound of the sun rising, and everybody knows the first 30 seconds of it. But if you listen to like the whole piece, it goes through all these shades, and it gets very kind of dark in a lot of cases as well. And the sound here is the sound of the soul of a very melancholic people. There's a kind of darkness about it, even at the break of dawn in this Morning Mood piece. And that is to say, there's something very Norwegian about it. There's something of the primordial north in it. So listening to the Peer Gynt Suite, you get this kind of deep sense of the Nordic folk soul. And I remember listening to this suite when I was a bit older, kind of on the eve of Halloween. What this feels like. Anybody who lives in a remotely northern climate, when the kind of veil between the worlds is thin, you can almost like hear the dead souls whispering in the naked trees and the wind. You know that feeling, Dave. I know that you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I remember feeling that. I remember feeling what it is listening to this music in that space. Feeling what it is to be a peasant on the heath in the time of trolls and elves and giants and everything. There's something deeper, almost like even more real than your day-to-day existence in the Peer Gynt Suite. And all of this was born out of the folk soul of a people. It was born out of the nation of Norway, out of nationalism and the romantic nationalist classical movement. And now someone's going to come and tell me that all of that is wrong. They're going to tell me that it's evil, that it's backwards, or whatever. Well, when you do that, here's the thing that these people don't understand. When you tell me that something that close to the heart is evil, you don't make me hate nationalism. What you make me do is you make me love everything that my society tells me is evil.
Yeah.
And for me, this was maybe my very first, like, it was the first glitch in the matrix, right? Like, especially for Canadians, we have it much worse than Americans. Like, even from my youth, I was always taught that nationalism is just pure evil. And this made me question things. It made me into one of the only people I knew that actually took nationhood and nationalism seriously. I can't underscore that enough, that how much this made me question things. It was really like my first red pill. So there is a power in aesthetics that like no argument can ever touch. But we'll get to all that. But I think a lot of people have had a similar experience with this kind of nationalist classical music.
That's really, like, when you're describing being taught from birth about how nationalism and stuff is evil, that's like an experience that I can't sympathize with or empathize with. I guess it's probably like that now, but when I was growing up, you were to be a patriot. You know what I mean? You were supposed to be an American patriot growing up. If you didn't stand and put your hand on the heart for the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning at school, you got detention. They called your parents. You were to respect America. You know, it was USA. You know, if you didn't do that, you were seen as a douchebag. You know what I mean? You were rotten. You were, you know, so I guess, you know, that's
very different than my experience, to be honest. Like most of my friends, by the time like I understood what nationhood or nationalism even was, were just like, well, yeah, obviously it's stupid. Like nobody believes that shit. But that's the Canadian experience. And to an extent, also that's the European experience, but it's not really the American experience. And Americans get denigrated in well, everywhere, but like, you know, outside of America, but especially, you know, in liberal spheres, not so much in like, you know, our thing or whatever, but Americans kind of get shit on for being patriotic and being these kind of like, whatever, rednecks, whatever, you know, they just, you know, the McBurger sort of stereotype kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it's like, look, this is something natural, normal, healthy, and good. And it's a real feather in the Americans' cap that that you guys have maintained it for a lot longer than almost anywhere outside of the Western Hemisphere. So, you know, take this from a Canadian. You won't get this compliment from a Canadian very often. So there it is.
Yeah, that's we get blasted all the time. You know, in nationalist circles, we still get blasted that we're, you know, especially the global American empire thing. There's guys that, you know, equate that to like the American people, like we've ever had anything to do with that. It's just, I don't know. I still have that. And you know what? It's sort of a strange phenomenon when you watch American liberals try to like jam this the new globalist, right? The new globalist ideology into American patriotism. They're like, we're the real Americans. This is for America. They do that. They say we have to protect our democracy. This is America, you know. And then they accuse their opponents of not being real Americans. So this is like,
nobody buys that. Not even them, to be honest. Like it's just so cynical.
You know, I've seen it that even liberal Americans, the nationalism of Americanism is so deep in them that they'll get pissed. Like if like somebody from Ireland or Germany or whatever comes up to them and says something nasty about the American mythos, they'll have a visceral reaction. I've seen it. They will not like it. It's you know, for example, I don't care. Like I understand that the American Revolution was not in line with what we believe now. I understand that maybe George Washington wasn't our guy. But if you come over and you start talking shit about George Washington, I'm going to punch you in the mouth because he's our guy. Yes.
So you're a home team guy, right?
I'm a home team guy forever. I don't even care if they were dicks. That's it.
Yeah, no, I definitely, it's something I've always admired about Americans. And like, even from when I was a kid, like I still remember when I was a kid, like, and I think this had more to do with like American culture, just sort of dwarfing Canadian culture. You know, like we take so much from you guys that like I remember asking my parents. I would have had to have been about like 8 years old or something like that. I'm like, why are the Americans so much better than we are? And they were fucking horrified. They were horrified. They were like, what are you talking about, right? But here's the thing, though, is you know. Canadian pride, especially when, you know, from my youth forward, I think probably going back about 30 or 40 years before that, it was something very different. There was a genuine pride there that was lost. But from my time forward, Canadian pride is more or less sort of confined to being non-American, to being everything America isn't, you know what I mean? Like it's and not even like what America really is, but like the caricature version of it. So, you know, this is why the only reason why my parents really hate Donald Trump is because Trump sort of to them in the boomer experience represents the ugly American, right? What their idea of the caricature of what Americans are. And when I said, you know, why are Americans so much better than us? You know, in my sort of distorted 8-year-old apprehension, what I'm really saying is why is American culture so dominant? but the Canadians can't really brook that. We have to sort of, I don't know, we kind of tell ourselves these lies. It's too bad, because we really do have a lot to be proud of. I think, I agree with you that the American Revolution was a mistake. From my Canadian perspective, I mean, we won't get into that because it'll become a real debate. But I think Canadians have a lot to be proud of, maintaining their Britishness, essentially, to boil it all down. But Americans have a lot to be proud of too, and maintaining patriotism and nationalism is one of those things. And there is American nationalist classical music as well. So, but I think that it's important that the aesthetic side, like, is given its due, because nationalism is something that is really felt before it's justified. But that's the way that everything pretty much goes. I mean, that's not to say, I mean, someone that's hostile to nationalism would say, well, that just means it's stupid and irrational and whatever. But no, this is actually the way that humans work. This is the way that people come to believe things. They don't undertake a syllogism and then believe, right? Like, the belief comes first. And most of the time, the belief is dictated by things like love and sentiment before it's dictated by reason. So it's important. This nationalist classical music had a very important role to play in the 19th century when it was a real going concern.
Yeah. And you mentioned about nationalism being it's a visceral thing. It's something you inherit, right? So, and also speaking of Canadianism, so this actually happened. I've been meaning to tell you about this. So I should tell you about this right now. I know you're going to like this. So the other week, I was driving to the gym, right? And I get like little albums that I get obsessed with over a certain amount of time. And for a few days, I was obsessing with 2112, with Rush's 2112. So yeah. So I'm driving, and it's playing the one song, the Overture, Temple of Syrinx or whatever. And I'm pulling up to the red light, and it gets to the really awesome part, right? We are the priests of the temple. It's playing that part, and I'm just like rocking out, because that's such a great part. And I hear a beep, like somebody next to me at the light beeping. I look over, there's like a Subaru with the packing thing on top, like a bunch of stuff, people on vacation, and there's a whole family of people in this car pumping their fists out the window with me to Rush.
Nice.
And I was like, yeah, I like raised my fist to it, whatever. They pulled away Ontario plates.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So, but I thought about it. I was like, loving Rush, even though it is like a rock and roll band, it is a modern thing, is like part of the Canadian identity, at least from my perspective. These guys have probably heard this song umpteen million times, right? They've heard this music over and over and over again. But to be like in America and to hear, even though Rush is a global super band, right? Everybody knows who they are. But for them to like be in America and to hear like an American cranking their music was like, they got excited about it, right? So that was almost like them expressing their like Canadianness in America with like, I don't know. It was pretty funny. It was pretty. Yeah. It was like a living stereotype. But I don't know. I loved it that they got that amped about somebody else listening to Rush. I thought it was
for
cool.
Sure, man. Yeah, there is a kind of. I mean, like Rush is not a political band by any stretch of the imagination or whatever, but it is an emblem of Canadianness. Canadahood, Canadianness, and it's something that we take pride in, right? Like, we certainly have. I mean, Canadian culture is not just a carbon copy of American culture. What I always found kind of weird is that you guys never got the Tragically Hip. Do you even know who this band is? Have you heard the name of that band, the Tragically Hip?
No, I've never heard of that.
See, to me as a Canadian, that's fucked. That's like you saying to me that you've never heard of AC/DC or Jimi Hendrix. That is the status of this band in Canada. They are like they're right up there, not quite Elvis, but like, slightly below that tier kind of thing. and it's crazy. Like they never broke in America. They're an amazing band. I think you'd really like it. It's a real like 90s hard rock band, and they're just like, they're so fucking Canadian. A lot of this, maybe that's why they haven't broken America, because basically like a lot of the music is, a lot of the lyrical content is storytelling and stuff that's just Canadianana. You know what I mean? It's just very, it's stuff that's particular to our country and everything like that. And I think that's what makes it cool. That's like, you know, when you listen to do you know much King Crimson? Do you listen to much King Crimson?
I've heard some of the popular songs.
Okay, yeah. So King Crimson's a weird band in that they were basically like, it's one guy that has like essentially reformed this band completely from the ground up several times. The first incarnation back in the 60s was very, very British sounding because it was all Brits. And then one of the later incarnations in the 1980s was like a cross between, there's two Brits and two Yanks. So it's a lot more American sounding, you know? And you can kind of get the feel of, you know, where the people in the band are from just by the sound of the music. And it's kind of like that with the Tragically Hip as well. So it's always been weird to me, and weird to a lot of Canadians, that you guys don't have the Tragically Hip there. You should check them out. But yeah, it's you know, the soul of folk, where they're from and what they're all about, is embedded in their folk music, of course, but like their popular music too. I mean, back far enough, those two things would have been exactly the same thing. But yeah, so maybe we should do a little bit of a dive into Romantic nationalism and sort of like how the classical music of that era dovetailed with nationalism itself.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about this already in one of the earlier episodes when we did Romanticism and the Volksgeist, the folk spirit, which is pretty close to the folk soul. But we talked mostly there about like the philosophical dimensions of Romanticism. But I think we should talk a bit about the like political situation that was going on at the time. So after the Napoleonic Wars, this would have been about like 1810s or so, 18 teens, something called the Congress of Vienna was called. And basically what happened was, you know, the French Revolution was a success. It steamrolled overall, you know, a lot of the traditional societies in Europe at the time. And this Congress of Vienna was essentially the victors redrawing the traditional boundaries of nationhood. And it touched off a lot of serious problems. Basically, it sort of inaugurated a revolution every 5 minutes. Like you can think of the instability in Iraq post-World War I, after the borders were redrawn with absolutely zero thought for, like, you know, tribal boundaries or whatever, and all the problems that caused, probably on purpose. But anyway, this is what happened in Europe as well after the Congress of Vienna. And it essentially gave birth to nationalism, because the redrawing of the boundaries basically made it so that people suddenly, all of a sudden, their attachment to their people, to their folk, to their nation really became very important to them, because they had kind of lost it, right? So nationalism is really the idea that a person owes loyalty to a group of people before an idea, right? I posted that article a few days back on propositionality. Nationalism is really kind of the anti-propositionality, almost pure anti-propositionality. It's also a kind of relatively classless phenomenon. So the people that the nation refers to, you know, the group to whom you're loyal, is the people that constitute that nation is generally the peasant class. But for the most part, like actual nationalists on the ground, you know, the guys with the rifles in their hands, were members of the middle class. So there's a kind of an inherent class collaboration aspect to nationalism. So you can see why Marx hated it. And nationalism kind of arose as, I mean, after this Congress of Vienna and the Napoleonic Wars, nationalism was more or less a conservative force that kind of tried to draw boundaries rather than break them down. And very often it appealed to like ancient precedent and the conception of folkhood. Like it tried to draw these borders along ethnographic lines, not ideological lines like the French Revolution, not like petty political alliances or dynastic lines or anything like that. So the Romantic Nationalists, it came into conflict with, the reactionary forces of the church, but also the revolutionary forces of the French Revolution. So the Romantic Nationalists had to find ways to kind of justify and express what were, in some cases, very, very ancient ideas. So some of the ways that they found to justify their nationhood were looking back to like the ancient epics of their folk. So for the French, it might have been something like the Song of Roland or whatnot. For the Finns, it was compiling the Kalevala, their essentially their Iliad of like their mythic cycle, right? Mm-hmm. These people would the nationalists would look back to their ancient poetry. They would look to their folk costume, their folk dances, and even like not just looking back, but also new ideas of language and culture came to the fore. Like we talked about this in the Romanticism and the Volksgeist episode, specifically with J.G. von Herder, ideas that culture and language, like that language essentially in some sense dictates culture. And we talked about this in the last episode that we did as well. And that law was an expression of the Volksgeist as well. And of course, not just all these things, but also music. So music was an important part of how these nationalists justified what they were doing and how they essentially sold them, their political formula. So nationalist composers like Wagner, like Mussorgsky, like all these, Edvard Grieg and all these guys, the approach they took really dovetailed very significantly with Romanticism. And anybody listening to this, I won't go into that too much. We defined it in the earlier Romanticism episode. Just go back and check that out. But one of the things that this nationalist classical music had as a point in it was the rejection of formalism. We talked about how Romanticism was a kind of rejection of classicalism or the classical, neoclassical view of art. And so the classical age of music, we're talking like Beethoven and Mozart. I mean, Beethoven's kind of verging into the Romantic era, but yeah, definitely like Mozart is a little bit more classical sounding. This age with its like universal forms and everything is kind of like anathema to the musical expression of a folk soul. Like how can there be a proper method or structure of composition that cuts across all peoples if the folk is the origin and wellspring of musical creativity, right? So musical theory, that is like stuff like counterpoint and harmony and composition, all these things kind of became like a means rather than an end. So musical theory for the romantic composers becomes like a technical instrument and not really something that's studied in and of itself. It's studied in order to do things. And of course, these romantic composers were inherently particularistic as well. Like they were interested more in what was going on in their own backyard. They wanted to kind of drink from their own well, so to speak. So they would often, take folk song and like rustic music from the rural areas would become like a primary source of inspiration. Mm-hmm. And sometimes guys would even just take themes directly from these like folk compositions, like Bartók and Stravinsky famously did that. Like Stravinsky said, good composers borrow, great composers steal. And this is what he means. He's like, he actually lifted a lot of the themes directly from these folk songs. And the only other thing I'll mention here about how Romanticism dovetails with this national classical music is that the folk song sort of forced these composers to get really creative because folk song is so simplistic. The melody and the structure are just like, they're sort of like monodic. So it it resists easy assimilation into like traditional classical ideas of tonality and harmony and counterpoint. It's kind of like how blues, if you know your music theory, blues is really like, it doesn't follow any music theory. It's dissonant, right? Like if you have a if you have like a flat fifth on the 1, the 4, and the 5, it isn't in any key at all. So this is kind of the same thing that like folk music did for classical notions of tonality. And this kind of forced the composers to innovate, and they had to experiment with like weird, unusual musical textures. Like you could think of the chromatic section from Anitra's Dance in that list I sent you. In like what's otherwise a folk melody. So it forced these composers to get crazy actually with this stuff. And this was kind of an interesting instance of folk culture like directly influencing high culture. And the result was like this wild innovation that ended up like culminating in stuff like Eric Satie and Igor Stravinsky and like the 12-tone system and everything. So the result was really a one-of-a-kind aesthetic phenomenon. And honestly, for my money, realistically, I think that the Romantic era for music is really the high point of Western aesthetics. And I think a lot of it has to do with this rediscovery of the folk soul. So sorry about that. That was a super long rant. I'm sorry.
Nah, it's good. I really enjoy especially on this playlist you sent me, because there are so many like passages in these songs that it kind of completely derails, and these songs will go into these like it's almost, there's one song I can't remember which one, but I'm sitting there, I'm listening to it, and it's starting to give me an idea for a story, and I'm picturing a like we're going through a forest or whatever, and then it shifts and it kind of, there becomes a kind of, I don't want to say atonal, but certainly a dissonant melody. And then all of a sudden in my mind, the forest shifts into becoming like this haunted, like kind of evil place. And it's really incredible. And what you're mentioning here with folk music, this is how folk music is. And this is how folk music has always been. If you go back and you listen to some of the reconstructed folk music from the ancient world, I believe it's called the Hymns of Delphi or something like that. They reconstructed some hymns, some like songs from ancient Greece. And if you go back and you listen to it now with a modern ear, it does not, this is before music theory existed. So you have, it sounds very dissonant. There are parts that are kind of sound like they're off key. And obviously this is a reconstruction. It's probably not exactly what it sounded like, but it can give us a pretty good idea of what this old music sounded like. If you look at the instruments of like medieval and pre-medieval, you're talking about the various lyres and tagelharpas from the Norse, and you're looking at there's a lot of horn instruments that were used in the medieval times. One of my favorites is called a racket. It's like this, looks like it's like this jug shaped like flute, and it has this like really kind of quacky duck sound, like deep tone to it. A lot of this music, the oldest flute ever, what is that called? It's an Armenian flute, the duduk. The duduk, the duduk music doesn't even like really follow any sort of music theory. It just kind of goes off in these different directions, and it's really like creates this really beautiful offbeat, strange kind of sound. And you hear this a lot in this romantic music, because the romantic classical music, it did not take the approach of music theory. It's not a scientific approach to music. They went in there with this idea of, we're going to create something that forces an emotion upon you, that is an expression of the soul, that is it's more qualitative instead of quantitative, right? So it's coming from a place that is irrational, which nationalism is.
Yeah, and there's nothing like there's nothing to apologize for with that. I mean, this is like, it's the sort of deeper basis out of which all ethical propositions come from, right? Like, I mean, it's impossible to, no formal system is ever fully complete nor fully coherent. There are statements that come from outside of the system that are not justifiable from terms within that system. And this is the sort of the basic idea of irrationalism, is that something outside has to dictate effectively the axiomatic dictates of the system, whether it's moral or otherwise. So, I mean, like irrationalism, people kind of like misunderstand it and think that it's just like being a retard and just not doing, just doing whatever the fuck you want or whatever. No, it's not that at all. It's the idea is that there's something deeper and older, and I mean, frankly, that's divine, that is kind of dictating these things. And you kind of get some of this in the Romantic classical music as well. This is kind of after the Romantic era, but I consider it very much a nationalist kind of piece. I'm thinking of Stravinsky's Rites of Spring. I put one of those, a movement from that into the list that I gave you, Dave. And I kind of regretted the one I put in there because it's a very nice piece. It's a very nice sounding piece, but it's also kind of, it's like one of the, I mean, so what the Rite of Spring is basically is it's almost like the death metal of classical music. It's like this crazy, well, I'll describe it in a second, but basically it's just extreme music. Of a sort of like very late Romantic stripe. And the piece I put in there for you was something, it's kind of like the low point in between some of these like more extreme things. But it's still wonderful. But anyway, yeah, it's this, the Rite of Spring was premiered in 1913 in Paris at the Ballet Russe, because of course Stravinsky is a Russian, and they had this impresario Diaghilev from Russia that put on these crazy like Russian ballets that were just like extremely, like they kind of played up to the fashion at the time of everything primitive and savage, which was kind of in the air in like the Edwardian age. This is kind of like the fin de siècle, when people sort of understood at a very like at a very intellectual level this irrationalist substratum of that sort of is the basis of all of our like moral life. You could think of someone like Henri Bergson, who is unknown today but was important back then, very much of an irrationalist type. Anyway, they put on this ballet, the Rite of Spring, by this composer Stravinsky, who was like, you know, fairly well known at the time, but not like, you know, as well known as he came to be later. And this ballet, the Rite of Spring, was said to be especially primitive. The subtitle of it was Pictures of Pagan Russia in 2 parts. And basically what the story is about of this ballet is it's a sacral springtime rite where a girl is like sacrificed to her tribe by dancing herself to death. That's effectively, it doesn't even really have a plot. It's just basically the exposition of a ritual performance. That's the ballet.
And didn't the audience like start to riot and flip out?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. It's like one of the only, or maybe the only known classical riot on record, which is crazy. Like you could imagine these guys in like suits, just like, and fists flying and everything. And it's just like, but you can kind of understand why they got so pissed off, right? Because these were like, you know, these are like artiste types that were like there to kind of like see something that they did not fucking expect. Like they knew it was going to be like, you know, primitive or whatever, but I think they were expecting something kind of kitschy, and what they got was not what, you know, they bargained for. So like the opening note of this ballet is played on the bassoon, which is a very low registered instrument, but it's played on an almost stupidly high register, like almost intended to destroy the instrument. Like that's how fucking high this note is. It's like the thing can barely play it. So the first note, it kind of gets you off on the wrong foot, right? And all throughout the piece, there are these like violent outbursts of strings and brass and the savage fucking polyrhythms. Like you really listen to it and you're like, it kind of sounds like metal, but like Meshuggah, weird fucking metal, you know? Mm-hmm. They got these massively wide dynamic changes, like from a whisper to a scream and everything. And it's ultra dissonant all throughout, except for like bits and pieces here and there. He does like to Stravinsky's genius, like to his credit, he's not assaulting you the whole time. He kind of like does kind of seduce you at times to like just give you a little bit of like a respite or whatever. But for the most part, it's like super dissonant. He uses these like it's very experimental. Like different parts of the orchestra will be playing at different tempos at the same time. So it's like it's just disorienting. Like I said, it's like the death metal of classical music. And even the choreography in this ballet was said to be like ungraceful, and everything ballet is not supposed to be. Like the dancers are choreographed to enact this ritual that's set forth by, you know, immemorial custom. It's almost like automatic and uncanny, you know, not like humans are performing it at all, but like that it's like these demigods on the stage or whatever. So, I mean, to say the least, this was a bit of a shock to the audience. And, you know, the result was basically like one of the only classical riots on record. And it's not even clear what happened because like eyewitness accounts, apparently they contradict each other or whatever, but like apparently punches were thrown. The police were called. Somebody had to call a doctor or whatever. Like, you know, like a good mosh pit. There must have been like a mosh pit or something going in the front. But yeah, anyway, Stravinsky was apparently super pissed and ran backstage to like help direct the performers because there was a fucking riot happening at his concert. So he was not happy, but like in a way he'd kind of achieved his aim, right? And anyway, like the whole reason for this like stupid diatribe here is it's all just to say that music has this uncanny way of summoning up the spirit of a people, right? Even if that spirit is long buried. Like even in the case of the manicured 19th century French artiste crowd, they for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, they return to their fucking barbarian roots, right? And it kind of summoned up this thing. Like there's an almost theurgic power that music has. Almost no other artistic medium can do this. And you know what it's like, because you're a metal guy too. You know what it's like when you get in that mosh pit and you just go head to head with some guy, like, you know, accidentally even, like, and you just fucking like get knocked out or whatever. Like music has a way of like making guys do crazy shit. It is very, very, what's the word? It's very shamanic in a way. I can't think of the right word, but you know what I mean? So we can, you know, almost no other medium can do that. So we can understand how nationalist music can like stir guys up to fight and die for their country. And to say that like there's a kind of irrationalist basis, that the deep sort of prehistory of our folk soul in this music, like there's nothing to be ashamed of there. That to say that that's irrationalist. Maybe a better term would be pre-rationalist, because really what it is it's the precondition for everything that comes after rationality. And that's what this music does. That's what this music sort of sets forth. And you can hear it. You can hear it in Wagner. You can hear it in Mussorgsky, Night of the Bald Mountain. Very famous piece. Everybody knows that. And it's about a witch's Sabbath. All this stuff. Like this is kind of what was going on at the time with this nationalist classical music. So it's something I really encourage guys to dig into if you haven't. And if you're not familiar with classical music, this is a good place to start.
Yeah, it's dope. It really is dope stuff. It's like I said before, it's completely different than music that we hear now. And on the flip side, Mike's talking about music is like the most infectious and the most moving and the most influential art form, at least in my opinion. And unfortunately, the vampires, this is like their most cherished weapon, right? The music industry is their most cherished weapon, which is why they don't allow things like romantic classical music or awesome underground folk music or really dope heavy metal to really get into the big think of a society. They would rather pump out garbage pop music and mumble rap and just like whatever the hell else to poison people, because it can have that effect too, right? It doesn't matter who you are. It's called operative conditioning. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are. If you hear the same thing enough times, you will eventually begin to think it. And this is the strategy that the you know who's that control the music industry know. So they want to turn everybody into consumer cattle, right? So this is what they pump into people's minds. Now, if it got flipped and we started, letting everybody listen to Wagner or Tchaikovsky or just something like this, it would have a really big effect. Art sways people in a way that nothing else does, and especially music, like we're just talking about with the Rite of Spring Ballet. Like these guys, these are like well-to-do yuppie artiste people that got like put into a fervor, right? They boiled over into a fervor and chimped out, both good and bad. Who knows why? They just couldn't control them. They went animal. They chimped because of this music. These people probably have seen hundreds of concerts and heard hundreds of different songs and like all of this kind of stuff. And this one, for some reason, forced them to chimp. Like they didn't even have a choice. Like it was just like, it's completely irrational. And I don't know. I just think that I agree. I think it's really important for guys to dig into this stuff and listen to it and all this. But Mr. Mike, I have a question for you. So
Okay.
Here in Culture Dads and me personally, and I know you, we are big fans of recreating meaningful art, of recreating meaningful things. It's pretty tough to just like get together with your boys and make classical music, right? You need an entire symphony. Like you need to be somebody that really knows what they're doing. How do we recreate this going forward?
Okay. It's a good question. And I think it's a question I've thought a lot about, actually. But it's going to be hard for me to kind of give you the answer because, it sort of requires a little bit of background. So you think of what I've just described with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. This is a weird, dissonant thing, very different from Bach and Mozart, And classical music, that was 1913. 100 plus years has elapsed since then. And classical music has continued to change and get even more extreme in all of that time. It would not be worth sketching out exactly what the details of that are, but suffice it to say that when you listen to something like a horror movie soundtrack or something like that, what you're listening to is essentially modern classical music. It's where classical music went after, let's just say, the 20s and 30s. So you get into like the 40s, 50s, and 60s and everything like that. You get these composers like Penderecki, Stockhausen, and Ligeti, and modern composition, Schelze, and I mean, these are names nobody really knows. But if you heard some of the music, like if you listen to, so for example, Ligeti is very heavily featured in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So everybody knows the 2001 theme. Everybody knows the Strauss waltzes in that movie. But there's also other music in there as well. There's the creepy ass music that's playing when the apes are like, touching the monolith, or like during the end scene and everything, like where the guy's like going through this like psychedelic, like crazy experience and becomes the star child and all this. Yeah. That music there is by a guy named György Ligeti. So he's a composer that was active mostly in the 1960s. And basically, to give it the TLDR, it sounds like horror movie music. This is where classical music kind of went after Stravinsky, let's just say. And it continued to evolve and change and basically became extremely experimental, where it started to involve weird stuff like misusing instruments in creative ways, and doing things like, with the advent of digital and what we consider more modern type music, like the music of the 60s and 70s, tape manipulation and everything. So there was a guy by the name of Edgard Varese, who was very influential in Frank Zappa. He was a classical music composer. Stravinsky was influential on Zappa as well. Edgard Varese did a lot of tape experimentation. And this all sort of like, to cut through a lot of the history, kind of culminated in some of the weird underground shit that was going on in like the 1970s in industrial music. And now I'm not talking about Nine Inch Nails and stuff like that. I'm talking about bands or acts like Throbbing Gristle and Einstürzende Neubauten, these like really extreme bands that would like, Neubauten is this German trio, I think, that would like bring jackhammers and like industrial equipment on stage and like do like performance art with it and stuff. And it, the crazy stuff. Like this is kind of like this is where classical music eventually went. It went into performance art and stuff that we kind of like think of as like kind of left wing or whatever. But I don't think that's the right way of thinking of it. I think thinking of it as more Odinic is the right way to think of this kind of stuff. And basically, to sort of come to the point here, I think you're not going to. I think if you're thinking that you're going to get an orchestra together and you're going to write a symphony, you're kind of barking up the wrong tree. If you want to do classical music right, basically what you're doing is you're doing noise. You're a Wolf Eyes band, or you're something like that. You're some crazy ass like post-industrial dark ambient thing. Actually, a lot of what's going on with black metal, like the not just the metal, but the ambient side of it is kind of like it draws from some of the same well or whatever. So if you want to do classical music in the modern era, like I was in this band, I don't want to like dox any of the guys or whatever in the band, so I won't give you the name. But basically what we did was we were a kind of a couple of studio engineers that eventually decided that what we're going to do is we're going to creatively misuse studio equipment to create some of the most insane like feedback loops and just crazy stuff. Like we bought this one piece of equipment that was malfunctioning and took it as a kind of like signal generator to begin to like create like weird fucked up noise. And some of the stuff that we created from that was actually very ambient and soothing, but like eerie and discontenting and everything like that. Some of it was very harsh. This is basically, I think this is what classical music is today. It's basically noise and a lot of using like equipment and like tape manipulation and things like that in creative ways. This is where classical music eventually went to. And I think if you want to sort of like, if you're trying to be Wagner, it's just not going to happen. Like I would love like, some new Wagner compositions. But the fact is, I think that the zeitgeist is somewhere else today. So yeah, to sort of wrap this all up, I think that's kind of what classical music is today. Get yourself some like fucked up signal generators, start making noise with your buddies, and start like a weird ass noise punk band. I bet that's not the answer you expected.
No, well, sorta. So I actually thought you were going to go in that kind of direction. I thought maybe you would bring up like dungeon synth or something like that.
Yeah,
because I do think that some of classical music survives in things like I got a stack of dungeon synth cassette tapes right here, and it's kind of I sort of get a similar experience that I do when I listen to classical music when I listen to this stuff.
Oh, definitely. And here's another place that it survives. It survives in video game soundtracks. Like we talked in, I think it was episode 2 when we talked about the RPG. I was gushing for ages about Nobuo Uematsu, who's the composer for the Final Fantasy series. Mm-hmm. That guy, he was not classically trained, unlike the guy who did the Dragon Quest series, but he definitely drank in a lot of the classical sort of compositional techniques, even if he didn't study them. And you could hear in the Final Fantasy stuff a lot of classical influence and a lot of especially a lot of romantic influence, like the post-classical stuff. That very much so was influential on him, and you could hear it. And I even went to a series of concerts where, I mean, he was a video game composer. A lot of what he composed was just very short and repetitive stuff, but brilliant. And there was another guy named Arnie Roth who arranged it all for like an orchestra and sort of made it into what you would expect out of a symphony, like with some of those crazy transitions between the themes and everything, like things not repeating, 15 seconds and over again. I think that the classical spirit or the romantic spirit of classical music lives on in that too.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, whenever you bring up Final Fantasy music, I hear the melody when you win a battle. The dun 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 dun. Dun. I hear that in my head. That's how like memorable a lot of that music was. But no, I would agree with a lot of that. I think I think the spirit of classical music certainly lives on in movies. You might hate this, but my absolute favorite classical music album, I guess you could say, is the score from Conan the Barbarian. I absolutely love it. It's so good. It's good.
It absolutely fits the movie, and that's what it's supposed to do. Like, this is what programmatic music is. It's supposed to fit a scene, right? And this is what nationalist music does. This is what Wagner does. This is what all of these romantic composers do. Tchaikovsky himself was like famously bragged that he could create music for any occasion whatsoever, right? Like that's and I think that's cool, right? He's an artist, like he's a consummate artist, but he's an artist for hire too. He's there to fucking entertain, right?
Yeah, hell yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I love that. There's a lot of, some of the early Batman movies had such cool music. I would say that a lot of this, a lot of the classical spirit survives. You mentioned video game music. We mentioned movies. A lot of people, when they think of movie music, they mention guys like John Carpenter. You can't like think of movie music without talking about John Carpenter. And he really kind of like, created a genre. Like after that, it was like, okay, this is how horror movie music is supposed to sound. And it creates an emotion and everything like that. But I think that a lot of classical music survived in metal too. You could point to guys like Jason Becker and Yngwie Malmsteen, who are just virtuoso. I adore these guys. Satriani, Steve Vai, like these kinds of guys, like really. Now, some of them you could say that like a lot of it is just wank or whatever. But if you go through it, you listen to something like Jason Becker. He has a song called Altitudes that it's just gorgeous. It'll make you cry. It's just that beautiful of music. Malmsteen is just, everybody kind of like pins him as, he just like, he just wanks. He's just a technical guy. That's just not true at all. That guy pours his heart and soul into every bend, every note. That guy he's probably, I would say he's, as far as he belongs in the conversation of greatest musicians of our century, right? He's really, really tremendous.
I definitely went through a period where I was a Malmsteen enjoyer big time, and tried to sort of like level up to that stage, but I never got there and didn't really have the urge to do it. But I definitely respect his technical ability. But here's the thing: I think he also had like a handful of like pretty fucking good songs too. I forget what any of them are called now. There's like something sweet, and it's like it's got a very Phrygian tonality to it, and it's heavy, dude. Like I give the guy props. I wouldn't sit down and like chuck on some Malmsteen and like really rock out to it these days, but I definitely did at one point, and yeah, I can give him props or whatever. I'm trying to think of like where else the classical sort of spirit resides. I really do think it's experimental music, to be honest, like, because especially with these romantic guys, the earlier composers, like the Bachs and everything, like Bach was super experimental in his own way. If you listen to him vis-a-vis some of the guys like Buxtehude and some of these other like earlier Baroque figures that came before him, I mean, he's just on another planet. He still is on another planet today, but like compared to what was going on, he certainly is. But he was very much interested, like, he was very well studied when it came to counterpoint and everything like that, like very technical. And he certainly understood things from a music theory perspective very well. It's part of why he could improvise as well as he could. And clearly improvisation is important to his composition. But when you get to the Romantic era, things get a lot more weird. Things get a lot more experimental, and the tonalities get a lot more challenging. Like if you listen to Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, which is one of the first things that really made him famous. I mean, this was, I'm just going to guess that it was published in like 1840 or 50 or something like that. That's very early for a romantic composer. I'm actually going to look this up in a minute. But anyway, you can hear that, and it would fit in a, the tonalities, the chromaticisms are very like reminiscent of what was going on in the early 1900s even. This is something almost completely different from what was going on in like the first Viennese circle, in the early 1800s or whatever. It's very experimental. So I bottom line is I think that the spirit of classical music has to involve experimentation, especially the romantic spirit, and that's what the real sort of descendants of classical music are doing today.
Yeah. And I would say that in order for modern, a modern version of classical, and this is how you know that classical music, it's not even correct to call it classical music, right? There's all kinds of different, ages of it. It's kind of sort of separated by eras instead of genres, which I think is really, really awesome. That's the best art is separated by ages instead of genres, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But that it was tremendous because of how many different directions that it went. It influenced pretty much everything that we have today, right? And in order for it to be good, in order for you to do something that is in the vein of classical music, it has to be inspired by the folk soul. It has to come from, you mentioned the guy that said, good composers borrow, great composers steal. In order for your music today to be, in order for your fine art period, for high art period to be good, it must be informed and inspired by folk art. Always. If it's not, then it's just some meaningless, hollow bourgeois circle jerk, which is what we see now.
But it's also of its time and place as well. And the bottom line is, much as though we wish perhaps we lived either long ago or far in the future after we win, we live when we do now. We are products of modernity, and there's something noble in kind of leaning into that and owning it, right? Like, I think that some of the, like, I certainly won't go into specifics or anything like that, but I think there's a kind of dead end approach that you kind of see sometimes in our sphere with aesthetics, where the idea is basically to just do a complete retread of the past, or to like just copy paste political themes onto like pop music of today or whatever. The spirit of the Indo-European is to at once be, he's the man that maintained his hearth fire from time immemorial, but he's also the one that forged the cutting edge weapon out of that same hearth fire. He at once, he's like the Janus figure. He's looking ahead and behind at the same time. You really are like, if an artist today that I think is really going to make a big impact and that is going to really help our thing or whatever, is going to be the one that draws inspiration from the past, but also is innovating towards the future and is really doing something that other people, not just doing what's going on now, but just it takes the time that he's living in and leans into it and looks forward and is doing something kind of innovative and experimental. That is really the key, I think. And I nationalists and right-wingers in general are kind of very conservative in their the way that their outlook and everything. And I think that we need some more of that Odinic side to us, because I really do think of us more of as that than I do as like fascist or nationalist or anything else. We are that sort of like crazy berserker type that is there to just like fuck shit up as much as, but also in the name of tradition, paradoxically. So that's the musician who is going to make a splash and a real impact in our scene is the one that's going to be doing that.
Yeah, I love that. I really take issue with fetishism that a lot of guys have, where they kind of just like look at old paintings and marble statues, and then they kind of sit in this stasis of stagnancy and like mourn what was instead of creating something for now. And I think that is suicide. That's like nobody in history, our ancestors would look at that and be like, dude, what are you making now? Like, they wouldn't, I don't think that they would respect that. I think they would respect the guy that creates something now that would impress them. Right. So I would say, for me, when I create things, when I get in and I write, or I do this or X, Y, Z, this is just coming from inside of me, because I don't think that the tradition we should learn the techniques and observe the traditions of the past. That's part of who we are, but we are also the tradition, right? If you are aware of and you know of the tradition and the techniques of the tradition, man, all you got to do, in my opinion, get on your knees and pray to your ancestors and pray to the gods, and then take some fucking mushrooms and create something that comes from deep within your soul without any sort of hangups, and just create. Even if it's something that, even if it's like you don't even know, just fucking do it. And I don't know. That's my opinion. That I think that it comes from an irrational, spiritual, qualitative, imaginal place from within us. Because we should observe the tradition. We shouldn't just make some nonsense. But also, it has to come from a living fire, and that living fire is in our blood.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can take a page from these romantic nationalist composers. You listen to Wagner, there's a lot of fire in that. You listen to the Ring Cycle, that piece that I sent you, I think it was the Sigurth's Balefire. That is pretty fucking fiery. So take that as your inspiration, but it's not a dead husk. You're not there. It's not the Weekend at Bernie's version of Wagner. You're not just dressing it up a corpse and recreating it. It's like you're doing your own shit. And I think he would have a lot more respect for that. So yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Awesome episode. All right, Mr. Mike, you want to close it out?
Sure, yeah. So thank you guys for listening. Very much appreciative of each and every one of you guys. If you want to check out what's been happening recently, of course, imperiumpress.org. We just did the release of Horizons of Iron. I think this is an amazing book. Speaking of aesthetics and making an impact at a pre-rational level, at the level of the folk soul. Arthur Powell. This is the first original poetic work that we've published, and it's the first one for a reason. He's an amazing poet. I've admired his stuff for years, and I'm very happy that we've put this out. So I can't wait to see how it impacts the broader scene. There's a lot more going on as well. There's actually essays interspersed throughout. It's a very interesting piece of work. So check that out. We got lots coming down the pipe very soon, but we'll wait to announce that. If you want to check out what Dave's doing, go to thebizarchives.com. He's been super busy. He and I were talking before we started, just the woes of publishing dads staying up till like 3 a.m. He's got some interesting stuff, very interesting stuff coming down the pipe. So be on the lookout for that. But for now, thank you very much. Hails and blessings to each and every one of you, and we'll see you next time.